Hey everyone, welcome back to the last part of Chapter 3 on human migration in human geography. We've looked at some big patterns globally in recent migration patterns. Well, we looked at historic ones as well, but we ended up finishing our last lecture on talking about where people have been moving in the last decade or so, some recent trends in global migration. Now we're going to move on to looking at the migration history of the United States from when it was an early country just past the Revolutionary War up until the present day. The United States, of course, is originally a colony of Britain and became independent, but then more and more settlers would move into the United States and eventually expand it to its current boundaries. So that process of settling uh, and expanding that frontier came at a cost of displacing other people. There were competition for the space with the French to the north and in the southern Mississippi region, in competition with Spanish in present day New Mexico and Arizona and California, competition with the Russians all the way to Alaska, and then of course displacement and marginalization of Native American groups as part of that European settlement of what is present day America. Looking at this migration pattern tells us a lot about the past drivers of migration, but also helps us understand what's going on today with migration patterns. So here we have four phases roughly divided, and people might quibble about exactly where each of these phases start and stop, but these are pretty good and worth just considering as they are outlined here. The first phase here is this frontier expansion uh, in the earliest part of U.S. history. There wasn't a ton of expansion across the Appalachian Mountains. Most settlement took place along the eastern seaboard, but eventually European settlers started looking beyond the Appalachian Mountains and settling the Ohio River Valley and then eventually the Mississippi River Valley. Those migrants that expanded the frontier into what we consider the Midwest today were mostly migrants from Northern and Western Europe. This included places like Germany, Ireland, Norway. A lot of migrants came from those regions, and I'm just naming a few here, but there obviously there were more than just those three countries I named. Continued migration from Great Britain as well as part of this pattern. So we have a Northern and Western Europe predominant settler mix coming in here during this time. There was a little lull between phase one and phase two as the country had some economic hard times, and that was a little bit less of an economic pull factor. But then in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, we saw a new wave or phase of migration, this time coming mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. So places like Italy, Greece, Poland, Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia, the Baltic states. This is when my grandparents on my great grandparents on my father's side uh, immigrated from Lithuania and immigrated to the United States and settled in a suburb of Chicago. So one of the characteristics that changed, first of all, was the migrants stopped coming as much from Northern and Western and more from Southern and Eastern Europe. The other thing that changed was the drivers. Instead of expanding the frontier and a lot of people coming and seeking farmland in particular as part of that, there was more of a push towards moving to the cities. And so industrial development was really proceeding quite rapidly during this time as cities grew in size and industry really expanded dramatically during this period. It's important to note that during this time also there were some specific acts of exclusion in migration, and so our textbook mentions this, and it's well worth studying if you haven't already. And so, for example, during this era, during this phase of migration, the United States Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which which was designed to prevent more migration from China. And actually, a lot of the history of the region around Green River College, where this class is taught, featured some really despicable acts against Chinese people. For example, in Tacoma, Chinese people were confronted by angry mobs. Their businesses were burned, their homes were burned, and a number of them uh, were told to leave and even put on boats back to China by angry mobs. If you want to learn more about that, you can definitely check out. There's numerous documentaries, short and long. So I would start on YouTube and look for Chinese exclusion Tacoma, and you will find a wealth of information about it as and not a very positive part of our region's history, but one that's worth noting for its importance in terms of not always having the Statue of Liberty promise held true for being a country open to all migrants. 1910 to 1965 saw an era of reduced migration, largely due to restrictions on migration. So 1910 is probably a little early for this, more like 1920 if you ask me, but I'm quibbling here. We can look at the chart and you can see if you agree with me or not. But right around this time period, we started seeing more and more resistance to the idea, political opposition to migration. And so a number of quota laws were put in place. The quota laws were regional in nature such that they ended up having a racial effect. And so that's not explicitly racist, but it's implicitly racist. What I mean by that is that the quota laws that were put in place said the United States will not accept more people from a region that it doesn't already have in the population. And so that meant that areas where new migrants might have come from, in particular Asia or Africa or Latin America, were not allowed to come in great number, and Europe was allowed to come. The challenge here is that Europe was not a major source region for migrants during this time. It was quite preoccupied with some major world wars. The United States was also fairly unfriendly to bringing refugees from the war over because there was until the United States was actually involved in World War II, there was a fairly strong sentiment about staying out of the war and staying out of that conflict. So we saw low migration during this period until the mid 1960s. But then in the 1960s, immigration quotas were changed and started to accommodate the idea that there's other places in the world than Europe to accept migrants from. And we saw a major influx of migrants from Asia and Latin America. So let's take a look at this graphically here, and you can see these phases here. They're colored in with these blue and white alternating bands. And some of this is a little more clear, some of it a little less so, but you can see here this frontier expansion. The numbers aren't really large compared to other phases, but they're still in here, and these are these migrants coming from Northern and Western Europe. We see a major influx after 1880 up until the early 1900s here. And this is where I was saying the 1920s, there is this still bump. So you might put that bump all the way over here to say 1930 with the start of the Great Depression. But we see a major move from Southern and Eastern Europe in here as well. And then this really slow, it's called an immigration pause here. Now the numbers here still seem kind of large compared to here, but keep in mind the total population of the United States was relatively small here in the mid 1800s, whereas by the mid 1900s, the population of the United States was much larger. So these numbers of migrants, while they're similar in absolute terms, are a much smaller percentage. So this was a real pause in migration. And then the people who did come after World War II were largely from Western Europe. So that was people relocating. Jewish people in particular after World War II were likely to move to Israel and also to the United States. So there was a major influx there. But also people fleeing the uncertainty of Reconstruction after World War II did come to the United States as well. Then Starting around here, we've got the line, I think, actually showing closer to 1970 than 1965, but you can see that there's really not much of a blip here, but we can start seeing more and more people coming in, predominantly from Asia and Latin America for this fourth phase. This legislation that's highlighted here legalized the immigration status of a number of people who had already been in the country without full documentation, and so that represented a major influx of migration because everyone who was eligible to apply did, and then suddenly got counted as immigrants for that year. But you can still see that there's a steady trend of uprising here. A little taper here, and thinking about what's happening in the 2020s is an interesting thing to think about as well, because we've seen immigration really fall off since the Trump administration, really, but also the Trump administration put a lot of checks on immigration, and then COVID happened, and that really slowed immigration as well. So we've seen a fall off because of both those factors. What looking at that pattern tells us is it tells us more about migration than just the picture of migration to the United States, because I want to point out that there's a little bit of a pattern hidden in here that tells us about the relationship between migration and the demographic transition. And our textbook tells us this, but it doesn't make the connection as directly as I like. And so I'm going to make that connection really, really directly here because we just did this. So what I want to point out here is that the demographic transition in the world started in Northern and Western Europe, and it started in the mid to late 1700s. So by the early 1800s, Northern and Western Europe were growing rapidly in population. Rapid population growth means that there are a greater number of young people being born, usually, than the economy can support. And one of the things they can do is they can move. And that's indeed what happened here. The demographic transition went apace in Northern Western Europe through the 1800s, but by the end of the 1800s, those countries had largely transitioned into at least late stage 3 and maybe even some very early stage 4. And by then, Southern and Eastern Europe were in rapid population growth. So again, Southern and Eastern Europe were sending a lot of migrants out because their populations were growing rapidly and the US was accepting them. But then by the 1920s, even the Southern and Eastern European countries had really stopped growing as quickly, and so there wasn't as much pressure on people to move out. And that was the way it continued because of quotas restricting migration from elsewhere until the quota laws were revised, and then migrants from Asia and Latin America, which were undergoing rapid growth due to the demographic transition, were then welcomed into the United States. So the point being that countries that are growing rapidly, that is, if they're late stage 2 or in stage 3, so they have rapid population growth, they tend to be the source regions for migrants. Not always, but very often. And then countries in stage 4 and 5, that is low population growth and a good economy. You can have a stage 4 or stage 5 country and a bad economy, and it's not going to be a major destination region. But a country in stage 4 or 5 is usually a destination region for migrants from countries in stage 2 and stage 3. That's what we're observing even today in the United States, where migrants are moving from places that have more rapid population growth, and we have very low population growth in the United States. And so we're making up for that by accepting more migrants. The textbook asks a little bit of a challenging question here, which is, why do some countries benefit more from migration than others do? And it situates that question in the context of the reasons that people leave, these push factors that are pushing people out of places, and the reasons that they are pulled to some places. When a migrant moves to a country and comes there for an economic reason, for a job, sometimes they are resented by the local population because they're almost always willing to work for less than the population that's already there. That's a fairly common characteristic of economic migrants to a place. However, that usually benefits the economy because you have someone who is able to do the same amount of work or even more work for less money, and so that comes at an economic benefit. It might not help the workers they're competing with, but it helps the economy. But the other thing to think about is that when somebody moves out of a place, they're taking their ability and labor and contribution to society out of that place, and they might not be sending anything home. So some places have a, a feedback where workers come to work in a new place as guest workers or just as migrant workers or temporary, sometimes long term. But if they have a tie back home, they will very often send money home in the form of remittances. A financial remittance is a payment sent home to family or friends back in the home country of origin. And so that can really benefit the home countries as well as the country that's accepting the migrant. But sometimes it comes with less of that. An example of this inequality about source region and destination region are people who are fleeing violent conflict, and those are or persecution. Those people are called refugees, and then when they come to a country where they are looking for safety, they're called asylum seekers. So they're seeking asylum because they are refugees. Asylum seekers, by and large, do end up contributing quite a bit to the country that they come to. But sometimes when they arrive, they really don't have a lot of resources. They're literally fleeing for their lives in some cases. And so the direct contribution that they can give may be limited. And so there's political controversy about this sometimes. However, in the United States, we have a very clear policy that says we accept people who are claiming asylum. You need to demonstrate that you have a justified fear of persecution, and support that statement, because we're worried about people making false claims, I suppose. But as long as you can demonstrate your claim for asylum is legitimate, we have a universal acceptance policy for asylum seekers, for refugees who can demonstrate that they are seeking asylum. So that, as I said, it's sometimes controversial because oftentimes refugees are seen as, because they're desperate, they're not adding to the economy, and because countries like the United States believe that we're places for refugees to come, we do spend resources supporting them. Some people look at that and resent it, or feel like it's not a good use of money, or that it's a drain on the country's economy. However, most refugees end up being productive contributors to their new home's economy. So when they leave the home country, they may be taking away from that place. So that's a separate issue for that country that they're fleeing from. The other thing that happens is sometimes people migrate because they are highly skilled. And so one of the ways you can get into a developed country, an economically developed country like the United States or Germany or France, is by having a particular skill, something like a medical degree or a computer science degree. And so if you're a skilled surgeon or if you're a skilled programmer, you have a better chance of getting in on a special work visa to a place like the United States than a generic applicant trying to get into the country. The consequence of that is sometimes called a brain drain. So when the top graduates of a country's medical training programs and the top graduates of a country's computer science programs leave the country for higher paying jobs overseas, that's called brain drain. And of course, the countries that receive those workers benefit from brain drain. So that's worth thinking about. Places like the United States, we take advantage of that brain gain fairly unabashedly, because why wouldn't you want to have top talent come from around the world to work at your factory or work at your firm? Looking at these refugee flows here, we can see this is the refugee population by country or territory of asylum. So this is where refugees have settled for asylum. What we see is that the United States is a country that is welcoming to refugees in general, but because a lot of refugees these days are fleeing conflicts from places like Afghanistan or Syria or South Sudan, other places in the world, we see refugees concentrated in the areas fairly close to them, not halfway around the world. And so you can see here, for example, Germany accepts large numbers of refugees. Ethiopia is quite large on there as well. Uganda is big here. Again, from South Sudan, there's people fleeing that. Sometimes there's a conflict and there's a cross flow of refugees. So um, if there's a group that's a minority in one country, but then a majority in the other, then they'll move to that country if there's conflict over that issue. If it's a religious issue, then they'll flee to the majority group. But then there might be a minority group of the opposite pattern in the other way. So you'll see this cross flow across the border sometimes where refugees flee persecution and then go back to the country of where they would be in the majority, even though it's not their home. That can happen in some of these countries in sub-Saharan Africa. It has happened in um, India and Pakistan and Bangladesh before. So it's not unusual to see that. Syria, we've seen a reverse flow of refugees. A lot of refugees were displaced into neighbors of Syria, but now have begun moving back as Syria has become a little bit more peaceful, although there's lots of displaced persons still there. So, that's about all I have to say about that. Uh, let's talk about the present state of migration and in an increasingly globalized world and wrap this chapter up. The first thing that we have to say about the globalization of migration is that we've seen a fairly widespread backlash to migration. There have always been people who are uh, upset about migration or have negative attitudes about migrants or have strong political opinions about migration. That's fairly constant, but we do see that sentiment rising and falling over time sometimes. And in the mid 2010s, we saw a really strongly increasing anti-immigrant sentiment in places like the United States, but also in other countries in Europe, for example, where the political parties that had sometimes explicitly anti-immigrant policies as their platforms come to power, sometimes a little bit more nuanced than that, but still a strong anti-immigrant sentiment as part of their political rhetoric, came to power in many places around the world, including the U.S. and in Europe. And that's worth noting. It's worth thinking about. As a geographer who is interested in migration and interested in having the facts about migration, we would have a pretty poor economy in the United States if it were not for the strength of our immigration policy. And the reason for that is because our population would not grow very much if it weren't for migration. So we've been building our economy on the idea of continuous growth, and you can't grow your economy unless you keep growing your labor force, and we haven't been doing that from natural increase from population growth. So the United States is the country it is today, obviously because of all of our history of migration, and the idea that we're going to stop migration is a little bit of a weird place to be going. Um, I realize that some people who are opposed to the idea of migration will say, well, it's different now because it's 2020 or whatever. But one of the consequences we see right now is that there's a really tight labor market in the United States, which is at least contributing to inflation because in part we don't have enough workers, and or you could say enough people willing to work, but labor force participation is back to where it was before the pandemic. So something else might be going on as well. All right. Uh, the other theme here from migration and globalization is that a new trend we've seen, really, people have been started talking about this in the 1990s, but really in the 21st century is sort of a new idea, is the idea of transnationalism. And this is a fraction of the world's population, so it might be getting a little more attention than it warrants, but it is kind of a cool geographic idea, which is that we see some people now having an identity that is more than one nationality. So you could consider yourself a citizen of the world, or you can consider yourself to be a dual citizen of more than one place. And so, for example, you might have family in the Philippines and in New York, and you might spend your time between those two places. And that's a transnational identity. The idea of transnationalism is, of course, complicated because there are multiple transnational identities possible. But we also see the same kind of phenomenon happening in the European Union as people become less firmly attached to the idea of being from one particular place in Europe because they can move easily across the Schengen zone of the European of Europe, and then they can work very easily across international borders in Europe, and so they do. And so eventually you start thinking of yourself as a little bit more of a European, not as a German or some other national identity, right? That's the idea of transnationalism. Again, is it going to be a growing trend? Probably, but is it still relatively small? So far, yes, but that might be something to look for in the future as we look here towards what's going to happen. This last section of the chapter is a little bit squishy, as they sometimes get, where they say, well, we'll never know. But let's talk about the future of migration really quickly. First of all, we're going to see continued pressure for outmigration from places that have rapid population growth. Looking into the 2030s and 2040s and 2050s, most of the world is going to be slowing in population growth. However, a lot of countries in Africa will still have continued population pressure, especially African countries south of the Sahara. And the thing to watch here, as we talk about, say, 2030s, 2040s, is that population pressure plus climate change may very well put double pressure on those populations. So it's not just the push factor of too many people, populations growing faster than the economy can keep up, but also push factors from environmental pushes like increased risk of drought or increased risk of flooding, depending on which part of the continent you're in, and the related stress on crops and grazing land. And so that's a thing to watch for, and we might see fairly large migrations because of that, and maybe not just from sub-Saharan Africa. That's the one I'm highlighting because that's the place that will have the most rapid population growth in the next 20 to 30 years, but possibly other places as well might really be impacted by increased severity of weather events and or declines in crop productivity because of climate change or the like. Talking about the future, and this goes right back to what I said earlier. I sort of jumped the gun on this a little bit. It's a choice, and countries that are enacting anti-immigration policies or low immigration policies on purpose, sometimes that's a populist platform. Sometimes there's a lot of people in the country who feel that way. But it's at the risk of losing competitive footing because there are going to be some wealthy countries in the world that choose to accept migrants and choose to benefit from that because migrants, you can look back to any period in American history and find lots of examples of migrants being very successful as a first generation American. And if we look back in history, we can find people today whose parents or whose grandparents were first generation Americans that that thrived and succeeded and contributed to making America a wealthy and prosperous country. The other part about the future migration that our textbook notes is that we see some really big disparities in the mobility and the ability to migrate of the wealthy versus the less wealthy. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that we see migration really starting at the end of stage 2 and early stage 3, is that early stage 2 countries, people are too poor to migrate very far. International migration is less of an option when you're that poor. And so stage 2, late stage 2, early stage 3, you have population growth plus enough resources that people can start undertaking longer journeys, everything else being equal, of course. But then the wealthy, the truly wealthy, can decide to move around the world as they like. And especially with the changing face of work here with the pandemic, we may see more of this. We may see people choosing to live and work remotely in a location that they prefer. As a matter of fact, I have a former student who ended up in computer science and chose to live in Switzerland while working remotely for the entire winter. So it's not that crazy of a concept to imagine that people might just start doing that more regularly, as long as they have the financial resources and a flexible enough job to do that. That is all I have for you for chapter 3. I hope that was illuminating and interesting. And I can't wait to move on to chapter 4, because that is a fantastic one as well. I'll see you for that soon. That's all for now. Thanks very much.